Alice Munro, The Found Boat, 1974. At the end of Bell Street, McKay Street, Mayo Street, there was the flood. It was the Wawanash River, which every spring overflowed its banks. Some springs, say 1 in every 5, it covered the roads on that side of town and washed over the fields, creating a shallow, choppy lake. Light reflected off the water made everything bright and cold, as it is in a lakeside town, and woke or revived in people certain vague hopes of disaster. Mostly during the late afternoon and early evening, there were people straggling out to look at it and discuss whether it was still rising and whether this time it might invade the town. In general, those under 15 and over 65 were most certain that it would. Eva and Carol rode out on their bicycles. They left the road. It was the end of Mayo Street, past any houses, and rode right into a field over a wire fence, entirely flattened by the weight of the winter snow. They coasted a little way before the long grass stopped them and left their bicycles lying down and went to the water. "We have to find a log and ride on it," Eva said. "Jesus, we'll freeze our legs off." "Jesus, we'll freeze our legs off," said one of the boys who were there too at the water's edge. He spoke in a sour whine, the way boys imitated girls, although it was nothing like the way girls talked. These boys, there were 3 of them, were all in the same class as Eva and Carol at school, and were known to them by their names, their names being Frank, Bud, and Clayton. But Eva and Carol, who had seen and recognized them from the road, had not spoken to them or looked at them, or even yet given any sign of knowing they were there. The boys seemed to be trying to make a raft from lumber they had salvaged from the water. Eva and Carol took off their shoes and socks and waded in. The water was so cold it sent pain up their legs like blue electric sparks shooting through their veins. But they went on, pulling their skirts high, tight behind and bunched, so they could hold them in front. "Look at the fat-ass ducks in wading. Fat-ass ducks!" Wait, no, that is fat-ass fucks. Bad boys. Eva and Carol, of course, gave no sign of hearing this. They laid hold of a log and climbed on, taking a couple of boards floating in the water for paddles. There were always things floating around in the flood: branches, fence rails, logs, road signs, old lumber, sometimes boilers, wash tubs, pots and pans, or even a car seat or a stuffed chair, as if somewhere the flood had got into a dump. They paddled away from shore, heading out into the cold lake. The water was perfectly clear. They could see the brown grass swimming along the bottom. Suppose it was the sea, thought Eva. She thought of drowned cities and countries, Atlantis. Suppose they were riding in a Viking boat. Viking boats on the Atlantic, clear sea beneath them. No, I've missed an entire line. Viking boats on the Atlantic were more frail and narrow than this log on the flood, and they had miles of clear sea beneath them. Then a spired city, intact as a jewel, irretrievable, on the ocean floor. "This is a Viking boat," she said. "I am the carving on the front." She stuck her chest out and stretched her neck, trying to make a curve, and she made a face, putting out her tongue. Then she turned, and for the first time took notice of the boys. "Hey, you sucks," she yelled at them. "You'd be scared to come out here. This water is 10 feet deep." "Hey, you sucks." That's just a generally good cut down, "you sucks." "Liar," they answered without interest, and she was. They steered the log around a row of trees, avoiding floating barbed wire, and got into a little bay created by a natural hollow of the land. Where the Bay of Summer, oh God, I keep skipping lines. I've got to get better at this. I'm sorry. Where the bay was now, there would be a pond full of frogs later in the spring, and by the middle of summer, there would be no water visible at all. Just a low tangle of reeds and bushes, green, to show that mud was still wet around their roots. Larger bushes, willows, grew around the steep bank of this pond and were still partly out of the water. Eva and Carol let the log ride in. They saw a place where something was caught. It was a boat, or part of one, an old rowboat with most of one side ripped out. The board that had been the seat just dangling. It was pushed up among what? Among the branches, lying on what would have been its side, if it had a side. The prow caught high. Their idea came to them without consultation at the same time. Okay, I'm sorry about that. "You guys! Hey, you guys! We found you a boat! Stop building your stupid raft and come and look at the boat!" What surprised them in the first place was that the boys really did come scrambling over land, half running, half sliding down the bank, wanting to see. "Hey, where? Where is it? I don't see no boat." And what surprised them in the second place was that when the boys did actually see what boat was meant, this old flood-smashed wreck held up in the branches, they did not understand that they had been fooled, that a joke had been played on them. They did not show a moment's disappointment, but seemed as pleased at the discovery as if the boat had been whole and new. Well, that's because they're boys. They could not imagine that these girls would play a trick on them. They are calling them over because there was important business. They were already barefoot because they had been wading in the water to get lumber, and they waded in here without a stop, surrounding the boat and appraising it, and paying no attention, even of an insulting kind, to Eva and Carol, who bobbed up and down on their log. Eva and Carol had to call to them. "How do you think you're going to get it off? It won't float anyway. What makes you think it will float? It'll sink. Glub, glub, blub, blub. You'll be drowned." The boys did not answer because they were too busy walking around the boat, pulling at it in a testing way to see how it could be got off with the least possible damage. Frank, who was the most literate, talkative, and inept of the three, began referring to the boat as she, an affection which Eva and Carol acknowledged with fish mouths of contempt. "She caught two places. You got to be careful not to tear a hole in her bottom. She's heavier than you think." It was Clayton who climbed up and freed the boat, and Bud, a tall, fat boy, who got the weight of it on his back to turn it into the water so they could half float, half carry it to shore. All this took some time. Eva and Carol abandoned their log and waded out of the water. They walked over land to get their shoes and socks and bicycles. They did not need to come back this way, but they came. They stood at the top of the hill, leaning on their bicycles. They did not go on home, but they did not sit down and frankly watch either. They stood more or less facing each other, but glancing down at the water and at the boys struggling with the boat as if they had just halted for a moment out of curiosity and staying longer than they intended to see what came of this unpromising project. About 9 o'clock, or when it was nearly dark to people inside the houses but not quite dark outside, they all returned to town, going along Mayo Street in a sort of procession. Frank and Bud and Clayton came carrying the boat, upside down, and Eva and Carol walked behind, wheeling their bicycles. The boys' heads were almost hidden in the darkness of the overturned boat, with its smell of soaked wood, cold, swampy water. The girls could look ahead and see the streetlights in their tin reflectors, a necklace of lights climbing Mayo Street, reaching all the way up to the standpipe. They turned onto Burns Street, heading for Clayton's house, the nearest house belonging to any of them. This was not the way home for Eva or for Carol either, but they followed along. The boys were perhaps too busy carrying the boat to tell them to go away. Some younger children were still out playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, though they could hardly see. At this time of year, the bare sidewalk was still such a novelty and delight. These children cleared out of the way and watched the boat go by with unwilling respect. They shouted questions after it, wanting to know where it came from and what was going to be done with it. No one answered them. Eva and Carol, as well as the boys, refused to answer or even look at them. The 5 of them entered Clayton's yard. The boys shifted weight as if they were going to put the boat down. "You better take it around back where nobody can see it," Carol said. That was the first thing any of them had said since they came into town. The boys said nothing, but went on, following a mud path between Clayton's house and a leaning board fence. They let the boat down in the backyard. "It's a stolen boat, you know," said Eva, mainly for the effect. "It must have belonged to somebody. You stole it." "You was the first one. Yous was the ones who stole it then," Bud said, short of breath. "It was you seen it first." "It was you who took it." "It was all of us then. If one of us gets in trouble, then all of us does." "Are you going to tell anybody on them?" said Carol as she and Eva rode home along the streets, which were dark between the lights now and potholed from winter. "It's up to you. I won't if you won't." "Well, I won't if you won't." Everybody's just afraid, I think. Sorry about that bump. Hit the thing. They rode in silence, relinquishing something, but not discontented. The board fence in Clayton's backyard had every so often a post which supported it, or tried to. And it was on these posts that Eva and Carol spent several evenings sitting jauntily, but not very comfortably. Or else they just leaned against the fence while the boys worked on the boat. During the first couple of evenings, neighborhood children, attracted by the sound of hammering, tried to get into the yard to see what was going on. But Eva and Carol blocked their way. "Who said you could come in here?" "Well, just us can come in this yard." These evenings were getting longer, the air milder. Skipping was starting on the sidewalks. Further along the streets there was a row of hard maples that had been tapped. Children drank the sap as fast as it could drip into the buckets. The old man and woman who owned the trees and hoped to make syrup came running out of the house making noises as if they were trying to scare away crows. Finally, every spring the old man would come out on his porch and fire his shotgun into the air. and then the thieving would stop. Jesus. None of those working on the boat bothered about stealing sap, though all had done so last year. The lumber to repair the boat was picked up here and there, along back lanes. At this time of year, things were lying around, old boards and branches, sodden mitts, spoons flung out with the dishwater, not with the dishwasher, with the dishwater, lids of pudding pots that had been set in the snow to cool, all the debris that can sift through and survive winter. The tools came from Clayton's cellar, left over, presumably, from the time when his father was alive. And though they had nobody to advise them, the boys seemed what? Seemed to figure out, more or less, the manner in which boats are built, or rebuilt. Frank was the one who showed up with diagrams from books and popular mechanics magazines. Clayton looked at these diagrams and listened to Frank read the instructions, and then went ahead and decided in his own way what was to be done. Bud was the best at sawing. Eva and Carol watched everything from the fence and offered criticism and thought up names. The names for the boat that they had thought of were Water Lily, Seahorse, Flood Queen, and Carol Eve after them, because they had found it. The boys did not say which, if any of these names, they found satisfactory. The boat had to be tarred. Clayton heated up a pot of tar on the kitchen stove and brought it out and painted slowly, his thorough way, sitting astride the overturned boat. The other boys were sawing a board to make a new seat. As Clayton worked, the tar cooled and thickened, so that finally he could not move the brush any more. He turned to Eva and held out the pot and said, "You can go in and heat this on the stove." Aw. Eva took the pot and went up the back steps. The kitchen seemed black after outside, but it must be light enough to see in, because there was Clayton's mother standing at the ironing board, ironing. She did that for a living, took in wash and ironing. "Please, may I put the tar pot on the stove?" said Eva, who had been brought up to talk politely to parents, even wash and iron ladies, and who, for some reason, especially wanted to make a good impression on Clayton's mother. "You have to poke up the fire then," said Clayton's mother, as if she doubted whether Eva would know how to do that. But Eva could see now, and she picked up the lid with the stove lifter and took the poker and poked up a flame. She stirred the tar as it softened. She felt privileged. Then and later, before she went to sleep, a picture of Clayton came to her mind. She saw him sitting astride the boat, tar painting with such concentration, delicacy, absorption. She thought of him speaking to her out of his isolation in such an ordinary, peaceful, taking-for-granted voice. On the 24th of May, a school holiday in the middle of the week, the boat was carried out of town, a long way now, off the road, over fields and fences that had been repaired, to where the river flowed between its normal banks. Eva and Carol, as well as the boys, took turns carrying it. It was launched in the water from a cow-trampled spot between willow bushes that were fresh out in leaf. Sorry about that. The boys went first. They yelled with triumph when the boat did float, when it rode amazingly down the river current. The boat was painted black and green inside, with yellow seats and a strip of yellow all the way around the outside. There was no name on it after all. The boys could not imagine that it needed any name to keep it separate from the other boats in the world. Eva and Carol ran along the bank, carrying bags full of peanut butter and jam sandwiches pickles, bananas, chocolate cake, potato chips, graham crackers stuck together with corn syrup, and 5 bottles of pop to be cooled in the river water. The bottles bumped against their legs. They yelled for a turn. "If they don't let us, they're bastards," Carol said, and they yelled together, "We found it! We found it!" The boys did not answer, but after a while, they brought the boat in, and Carol and Eva came crashing, panting down the bank. "Does it leak?" "It don't leak yet." "We forgot a bailing can," wailed Carol. But nevertheless, she got in with Eva, and Frank pushed them off, crying, "Here's to a watery grave." And the thing about being in a boat was that it was not solidly bobbing like a log, but was cupped in the water, so that riding in it was not like being on something in the water, but like being in the water itself. And soon they were all going out in the boat in mixed up turns. 2 boys and a girl, 2 girls and a girl and a boy, until things were so confused it was impossible to tell whose turn came next, and nobody cared anyway. They went down the river, those who weren't riding running along the bank to keep up. They passed under 2 bridges, one iron, one cement. Once they saw a big carp just resting. It seemed to smile at them in the blue and the bridge-shaded water. They did not know how far they had gone on the river, but things had changed. The water had got shallower and the land flatter. Across an open field they saw a building that looked like a house, abandoned. They dragged the boat up on the bank and tied it and set out across the field. "That's the old station," Frank said. "That's a peddler station, a petter station." I don't know what a petter station is, but that's what it is. The others had heard this name, but he was the one who knew, because his father was the station agent in town. He said that this was a station on a branch line that had been torn up, and that there had been a sawmill here, but a long time ago. Inside the station it was dark, cool. All the windows were broken. Glass lay in shards and in fairly big pieces on the floor. They walked around, finding the larger pieces of glass and tramping on them, smashing them. It was like cracking ice on puddles. Some partitions were still in place. You could see where the ticket window had been. There was a bench lying on its side. People had been here. It looked as if people came here all the time. That was so far from anywhere. Beer bottles and pop bottles were lying around, also cigarette packages, gum and candy wrappers, the paper from a loaf of bread. The walls were covered with dim and fresh pencil and chalk writings, and carved with knives. "I love Ronnie Coles." "I want to fuck." "Kilroy was here." "Ronnie Coles is an asshole." "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for a train." "Donna, Mary Lou, Barbara Joan." It was exciting to be inside this large, dark, empty place with the loud noise of breaking glass and their voices ringing back from the underside of the roof. They tipped the old beer bottles against their mouths. That reminded them that they were hungry and thirsty, and they cleared a place in the middle of the floor and sat down and ate the lunch. They drank the pop just as it was, lukewarm. They ate everything there was and licked the smears of peanut butter and jam off the bread paper in which the sandwiches had been wrapped. They played Truth or Dare. "I dare you to write on the wall, 'I am a stupid ass,' and sign your name." "Tell the truth. What is the worst lie you ever told?" "Did you ever wet the bed?" "Did you ever dream you were walking down the street without any clothes on?" "I dare you to go outside and pee on the railway sign." I think I could manage that if I had to. Probably. All right. Coming in for a landing on this story. It was Frank who had to do that. They could not see him, even his back. But they knew he did it. They heard the hissing sound of his pee. They all sat still, amazed, unable to think of what the next dare should be. "I dare everybody," said Frank from the doorway. "I dare everybody." "What?" "Take off all your clothes." Eva and Carol screamed. "Anybody who won't do it has to walk, has to crawl around this floor on their hands and knees." They were all quiet, till Eva said almost complacently, "What first?" "Shoes and socks." "Then we have to go outside. There's too much glass here." They pulled off their shoes and socks in the doorway in the sudden blinding sun. The field before them was bright as water. They ran across where the tracks used to go. "That's enough, that's enough," said Carol. "Watch out for thistles." "Tops, everybody take off their tops." I won't." "We won't, will we, Eva?" But Eva was whirling round and round in the sun where the track used to be. "I don't care, I don't care, truth or dare, truth or dare." She unbuttoned her blouse as she whirled. As if she didn't know what her hand was doing, she flung it off. Carol took off hers. "I wouldn't have done it if you hadn't." "Bottoms!" Nobody said a word this time. They all bent and stripped themselves. Eva, naked first, started running across the field, and then all the others ran, all 5 of them, running bare through the knee-high hot grass, running towards the river, not caring now about being caught, but in fact leaping and yelling to call attention to themselves. If there was anybody to hear or see, they felt as if they were going to jump off a cliff and fly. They felt that something was happening to them different from anything that had happened before, and it had to do with that boat, the water, the sunlight, the dark ruined station, and each other. They thought of each other now, hardly as names or people, but as echoing shrieks, reflections, all bold and white and loud and scandalous and as fast as arrows. They went running without a break into the cold water, and when it came almost to the tops of their legs, they fell on it and swam. It stopped their noise. Silence, amazement came over them in a rush. They dipped and floated and separated, sleek as mink. Eva stood up in the water, her hair dripping, water running down her face. She was waist deep. She stood on smooth stones, her feet fairly wide apart, water flowing between her legs. About a yard away from her, Clayton also stood up, and they were blinking the water out of their eyes, looking at each other. Eva did not try to hide or turn. She was quivering from the cold of the water, but also with pride, shame, boldness, and exhilaration. Clayton shook his head violently as if he wanted to bang something out of it, then bent over and took a mouthful of river water. He stood up with his cheeks full and made a tight hole of his mouth and shot the water at her as if it were coming out of a hose, hitting her exactly first one breast and then the other. Water from his mouth ran down her body. He hooted to see it, a loud, self-conscious sound that nobody would have expected from him. The others looked up from wherever they were in the water and closed in to see. Eva crouched down and slid into the water, letting her head go right under. She swam, and when she let her head out downstream, Carol was coming after her, and the boys were already on the bank, already running into the grass, showing their skinny backs, their white, flat buttocks. They were laughing and saying things to each other, but she couldn't hear from the water in her ears. "What did he do?" said Carol. "Nothing." They crept into shore. "Let's stay in the bushes till they go," said Eva. "I hate them anyway. I really do. Don't you hate them?" "Well, sure," said Carol. And they waited not very long until they heard the boys, still noisy and excited, coming down to the place a bit upriver where they had left the boat. They heard them jump in and start rowing. "They've got all the hard part going back," said Eva, hugging herself and shivering violently. "Who cares anyway? It never was our boat." "Well, what if they tail?" said Carol. "We'll say it was a lie." Eva hadn't thought of this solution until she said it, but as soon as she did, she felt almost lighthearted again. The ease and scornfulness of it did make them both giggle, and slapping themselves and splashing out of the water, they set about developing one of those fits of laughter in which as soon as one showed signs of exhaustion, the other would snort and start up again. And they would make helpless, soon genuinely helpless faces at each other and bend over and grab themselves as if they had the worst pain. The end. Anyway, that is the end. There are some questions which I guess we can go through. Number 1. Consider the details used in passages of description in the story. What kind of details are included? Oops, sorry about that. I keep hitting this thing here that is poking out. Let me move it, because that doesn't make any more noise than if I had just left it alone. It sounds like I'm getting oil out of an old pump. All right, that's over with. There's plenty of details in the story that come to mind. Just the way the grass is described, the way the water itself, images of being sleek as mink, I believe was one of the phrases. All of it is incredibly detailed, but not overly detailed. You don't get any lingering descriptions of their nudity, or for that matter, their personas. You kind of have to just imagine what these teens, I would guess, look like. Number 2, what is the level of diction in the dialogue of the story? From the dialogue, what do you learn about the various speakers? Well, I kind of pictured Frank as like a Batman, like the leader of the group, and I pictured Clayton as maybe kind of like the muscle of the group, maybe a little stronger. And I can't remember the other one's name at all. He doesn't seem to stick out. I imagined Eva as the leader of the girls, and maybe the more bold of the two. Obviously, she disrobes first and comes up with how they'll handle the repercussions of it. Number 3, study paragraph 10. Oh dear. What does the paragraph tell you about Eva as a limited point of view center of interest? How? Good grief. It's a very demanding question. This would have been the kind of thing that I would have not wanted to do in school. But paragraph 10 is about them paddling away from shore, heading out onto the cold lake. The water was perfectly clear. They could see the brown grass swimming along the bottom. Suppose it was sea, thought Eva. She thought of drowned cities and countries. I guess that is very specific. Suppose they were riding in a Viking boat. Viking boats on the Atlantic were more frail and narrow than this log on the flood, and they had miles of clear sea beneath them, then a spired city, intact as a jewel irretrievable on the ocean floor. And then she goes on to talk about, or declare, that this is a Viking boat. So that is very interesting. What does it tell you about Eva as a limited point of view center of interest? Well, we don't get points of view for the most part, but we do get this one focus of what Eva is thinking. So it tells you that she is, living in a place of childlike imagination, something bigger than where, this sounds like BS, but I think it is somewhat true. They're all of them are just sort of living, we imagine, in a kind of rural community, but also one with sidewalks and schools and all that sort of thing, and streetlights. Excuse me. So, in some ways, you could say that it gives you this idea that Eva sees more. She sees more. Okay, she sees something bigger than what's around. Imagine if this were not a log, but a pirate ship, or a Viking ship, rather. And that down there were spired cities. And I was the lady on the front of the ship. I mean, that's very romantic. It also says something about her spirit and her daring, I suppose, and her fearlessness. So, very interesting. Very interesting. I'm glad that question exists after all. Consider the last paragraph in the story. This is number 4. Consider the last paragraph in the story as a paragraph of action. What verbs are used, and how well do they help you visualize and imagine the sounds of the scene? What is the effect of the verb snort? Oh, good Lord. Well, the last paragraph is when the girls have dealt with what has occurred, their bout of nudity, mixed gender nudity that has occurred. It's painful enough when it's single gender nudity in a lot of ways. But here they are, they've done all this, and now we're wrapping up. Eva has proposed a solution, and it seems like it will probably work. But now what verbs do we get? We get a lot of giggling and slapping and splashing, and then exhaustion, and then the other would snort and start up again, and they would make helpless, soon genuinely helpless faces at each other and bend over and grab themselves as if they had the worst pain. So the verbs are slapping and giggling and splashing and developing, said about developing, and then we get snort. So we get a series of ing progressive verb tenses. Eva hadn't thought of this solution. So there's your past had not thought, past perfect, until she said it. So she said it. But as soon as she did, she felt almost lighthearted again. So the question is, what verbs are used and how well do they help you visualize and imagine the sounds? Well, you can hear the giggling. You can hear the slapping. You can hear the splashing. It's a good point to show how much just simple words can paint pictures. Not to sound too silly about it, but these are details, but they're not so overly done that you have to think too much about them to get the effect of it. And it doesn't always connect with the reader. Not every reader's going to hear the slapping and the laughing and the splashing, but some will be right there. And then you have the snort. And, I think that people can imagine what happens when the laughter starts to die out, and then one person snorts, and you can hear that as well. All right, question 5. From the lifestyle and artifacts mentioned, what do you learn about the time of the events and the economic level of the town? What is the effect of the facts that it is early springtime, that the water is still cold, but that in May the water is swimmable? And what are the implications for summer? Well, that is another really wonderful aspect of this story, is that it does do some world building, and you do get a sense. I mean, there is a mother that is described as an old, what is she? She's an old wash and iron lady, or old wash and iron woman, and she has a stove, but you've got to poke the fire into life. Now, I cannot imagine the last time that an American or whatever family had that kind of stove, where you burned wood and let the embers sort of die down, and then if you needed to cook something, you could poke them into life. No, we don't have that. We have electric. We have microwaves. It's a different world, so a different era, and so it tells you that this was a long time ago. And we also get some idea of the economic level, just because there are things that are found in the flood. There are artifacts. I think they mentioned something to do with pudding or cake, lids, and spoons, wooden spoons. And then just the idea that there is a flood, and it rains really hard and it washes everything out. But things have to be repaired, and that a man will come out and blast a shotgun off into the sky. That sort of thing in 2024 is less like, well, you know what, maybe not. Maybe people will, but at least it'll at least cause a disturbance in most parts of the country if someone shoots off a firearm. Not all parts, but we get the idea that this is the kind of place where there is, there's a rural aspect most definitely to it. And then the descriptions of the sidewalks, the clean sidewalks. Okay, so the children and the effect of the environment on the children, how they're sort of territorial when the boys and the girls come stomping through with their boat, and how they hear things and they want to see what's going on in a yard, but they can't. So there's fences. You get the idea that there's some suburban nature to this, although it may not be. It's not a classic suburbia, just a neighborhood. So you can get a kind of idea of the world that is here. And then in terms that, the water is still cold, and but then in May the water is swimmable. So we know that they're getting sap out of the trees, and we know it's going to be up north for the most part, and that if the water is still cold, we're probably talking further northern than Midwestern. So if I had to nail it down exactly, I would say probably northeastern, maybe something like a Connecticut or Maine or something like that. But there's no dialogue indications to really peg down an area. And what are the implications for summer? It's probably going to be, they're going to get all their seasons. They're going to get a hot summer in June and July, not like the ones we have now, which are just deathly record-breaking acts of, some terrible consequence of our actions. Like, I don't know what I'm saying here, but the summers, you can imagine this idealistic little town where they actually would have these regular seasons. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.